Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 194 with my guest, Krissy Bergmark. Krissy lives in Minnesota now, but studied at Northern Illinois University, where we have some shared friends and colleagues in Cliff Alexis and Mia Gormandy and Yuko Asada. And it was nice to get to catch up with Krissy. It turns out she had seen a lot of early percussion shows in Minnesota at the Southern Theater. And it was just great to hear about her background. We talk about things like gender disparity in the field and her experiences coming up, and sort of what she's working on now. And it was great to get to know Krissy. I always enjoy chatting with folks for the first time and getting to sort of start a relationship that way. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Without further ado, Krissy Bergmark. Enjoy. All right, let's gavel this to order. Krissy Bergmark. Bergmark?
Bergmark, yep.
Bergmark. Okay, great. I'm always terrified about getting people's names wrong. It's like It's my Achilles heel, so to speak. I'm terrible with names, so I apologize for dwelling on it so much. But Krissy Bergmark, thank you for joining me today. I'm always fascinated to get to know people kind of from scratch. And you mentioned in the Facebook message that we have crossed paths several times in various circumstances where, you've either seen So play or, and I know that you went to NIU, which is, I didn't go there, but I have very close relationships with Cliff and Liam and Yuko and Mia and all those folks who traveled through there. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, before we get into it, what was it that, I put a sort of blanket thing on Facebook of like, I'm tired of comment threads. Like, do people want to talk? Like, what was it? Why'd you reach out? Why do you want to talk? What do you want to talk about? And like, what prompted you to reach out? I'm always curious.
So I'll start at the beginning when we first started crossing paths. I went to a lot of percussion shows, especially like at the end of my undergrad and like as I was getting ready to go to grad school. And I remember at one point, like I used to come up and ask like questions after the concert. And I remember when you all played at the Southern Theater, I think you played, is it the Stephen Mackey piece with like the quarter-tuned pan?
Yes. Yeah. Oh my God.
Okay.
That was years ago. Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
The Southern
it was
Theater.
a long time ago. And I remember like I was getting ready to move to Minneapolis for grad school and I went to this show and my mind was totally blown by this quarter-tuned pan. And I remember I came up to you afterwards and asked you about it. And I was like, what's going on? Blah, 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 blah. And you were I think you were kind of like, oh, I don't know if you said don't tell Cliff, but you were like, you were kind of like, well, yeah, I don't know. I was trying to do this and trying to do that. And and I just remember like, through asking all of you different questions, like after the concerts and stuff, I remember like walking around at PASIC and I'd see you all and I'd like see that you recognized me and I'd be like, oh, hey. And so I remember we just like kept crossing paths and and so percussion was like so influential, especially around that time in my life, just like, seeing the path that you all were taking in terms of like creating new music for percussion and performing music for percussion. And you're a group that I really idolized and is really important to me still. And so when I saw your Facebook post, I was like, yeah, let's chat. This sounds great.
Well, I appreciate you saying all that. I think one of the things that I'm trying like with my own students and like, before we get into that, where did you go to your undergrad and where did you go to grad school?
So I went to my undergrad at Northern Illinois University, and then I went to grad school at University of Minnesota.
And that is it. What's his name?
Fernando
Mesa. That's right. Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right. He's somebody that he and I have crossed paths in various. I was a student when I first met him. Actually, I think he was giving a master class, or he came through the University of Akron, which is where I did my undergrad. So anyway, all these small worlds are colliding. But, I'm curious for you, like, I talk to my students all the time, like, and they say similar things about like, oh, I want to do what you're doing, or I think what you're doing is, or they look at what I'm doing or what So's doing and sort of think of it as something separate from like something they need to learn how to do. And I think to myself, like, I'm still learning how to do this. Like, I don't know. Like, there's not any
Totally.
any sort of like especially for what we do, there's not like a path like there is in the orchestral world or the
Right.
college teaching world. Like, what was some of the stuff for you as a student at the time, like running across different things? I mean, now you play tabla, you play steel drum, you do other things. Like, what were some of the things going through your mind of like, what did the career field look like for you at that time? Like, what were the possibilities for you at that time? I don't want to assume anything.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I think at the time I was like deep in the world of like percussion. Like,
Mm-hmm.
when you're an undergrad music major percussion student, you're like working on your grip and you're working on your snare drum rolls and you're like you're doing it and you're really focused. And so I was like deep in that, and I think I knew that like music was a really big part of me, and creating was a really big part of me, but I didn't exactly know what any path looked like.
Mm.
And I knew, I think at that point that, well, I did know at that point that I didn't want to be an orchestral musician. That just like wasn't really my bag. And I think the thing that really attracted me about like seeing groups like So Percussion and seeing, um, yeah, just seeing that was like entrepreneurial
Mm.
um, ideas that you all kind of used, and then just like seeing like the creativity and the exploration. And I think like when you're an undergrad in percussion world, you get really wrapped up with like that kind of insular
Mm-hmm.
community that you
Mm-hmm.
have. And I think that like I had this inkling of like, okay, there's something like past this, and I'm so wrapped up in this thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know what that is yet, but like I see this quartet of percussionists, and they're like commissioning works. I don't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, uh, you know, finding new ways to like, they're like, as a percussionist, you can choose your own instrument or rebuild an instrument or use anything you want as an instrument. And um, it was like, I think like chasing the exploratory and like playful nature and like chasing different sounds. I was just like, this is this is something like this is
Mm-hmm.
something I want to do, and this is something I want to get to. And I think like especially at that time I was like looking for a lot of like paths and a lot of like examples to map what my path would eventually be
Mm.
like against that.
It's not so different than, I mean, honestly, the things you're saying are the same exact conversations that, I've had in minivans with Jason, Adam, and Eric for 15 years now. Like, this sort of
Yeah.
like, there's something beyond this. Like, even
Yeah.
we look at ourselves, like, there's something, what are we not doing? Well, there's lots of things we're not doing. Just as people, like, you have to wake up every day. I made a choice to do a podcast with you today. I could be commissioning works. I could be doing other things. So
Yeah.
one of the things that for me as a student always bothered me about school was that, like, it seems like school, or the idea of schooling, you kind of, there's like a natural sort of set of handcuffs that you have to put on it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it can be this like, just come and hang out in this very expensive building for 4 years and do whatever you want. Like, I'm very curious now as a teacher, like, how do you treat music like a vocational school? I grew up, there was a high school called Buckeye Joint Vocational High School. And at the time it was like, I'm just going to paint with a broad brush here. This was where the kids who couldn't pass math class went. Like, this is
Okay.
the kids who like didn't want to be in school. These were the flunkies, like,
Yeah.
they're all the kids working right now, rebuilding engines, and like to me. And so now as a 41-year-old, I look back and I think I was not completely viewing that with a healthy outlook. Like, if we treated music similarly, where like, well, I don't know, I don't have a good question here, but I feel like we're treating artists, trying to teach artists how to do something quantitative when
Hmm.
most of what we do is qualitative. Like, there's a subjective nature to it. And
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like something that when I meet people who are, have nothing to do with my profession, and they're like, "Oh, what do you do? And what was it like for you to go to school?" And I'm like, "Well, it was like pretty expensive trade school is what it amounts to. Is
mm-hmm.
it's like, you're kind of learning how to do the thing, but you're taught, I think in music school though, you're taught all of these like yeah, these like skills and these handcuffs, and like sometimes that can feel like some hoop jumping too.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it doesn't end up being, it's like the first half of trade school. You know, you're not taught like all of the skills, you're only taught some of the skills, and then the rest of it you kind of have to like search out and find, I
Well,
think.
it's like, yeah, yes, okay, you're helping me drill down a little bit on this. It's like going to study surgery, but you only ever read about cutting heads open. You know,
Yeah.
like you can play Porgy and Bess until you're blue in the face.
Hmm.
But once you put it with the violins and there's a conductor showing you, all of a sudden it's not like those accents are now, none of them are on the downbeat.
Right.
You know, and it feels and it swings differently. And so like that's the difference. It's like you can, I remember I've never had to play Porgy with an orchestra, but I've played some pieces that were excerpt based, and it's, I could imagine, like, I don't know, every surgeon, every brain surgeon has to cut open that first head. Everybody has the first, like, oh my God, this is a human. Oh my God, all these beeping sounds. Oh my God, like you cut it
Right.
and blood shoots everywhere and you have to learn how to figure it out. Like that's
Yeah.
the thing I think with school that bothered me the most, always bothered me the most was like you worked for 3 months, you did one performance.
Right.
Like, what if blood shot all over me on that one performance? Am I just like, now I'm a bad surgeon?
Yeah, and sometimes it did.
Yeah, but this is the
Like
thing. Like,
that's yeah.
you know, as a student or as a teacher now, I'm trying to constantly tell my students, like, "Dad, you got to get out. You got to play for people. You got to, you know, set up a concert in the studio and just run through everything as if it's a show because it's important to know what that live fire is like. You know, there's that Mike Tyson has
Yeah.
a famous quote called everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like it's you could do the shadow boxing and all that stuff, but then you get clocked in the face by Mike Tyson. You're like, everything's, all your training's gone. You know, and
Right.
I feel like as a musician, and I think that's the thing that what you see in percussion sometimes is like the sort of privilege that we have is that I do get to play pieces more than once. Like that's what students are seeing isn't anything different than them, other than I've played It Is Time like 50 times. You know, like
Yeah.
that's the crucial distinction, you know. And so
Right.
how do we make school into something where you can't get out unless you play Two Mexican Dances 50 times? Like you have to have
Right.
choked down those horrible performances as a student, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Well,
Yeah.
let me ask you, like as a student, one of the other things too I'm always curious about, and it's been something that's in the sort of social discussions right now is gender equality and stuff in percussion in particular. And pardon me if any of these questions sound like rude or just blunt or insensitive, but like when I was a student, there were three girls in a percussion studio of 25,
Hmm.
and there wasn't. I don't remember there being any. Like it was this weird big family, and they were my sisters. These were my brothers. Like it was a thing, right?
Yeah.
It's now dawning on me as a 41-year-old looking back and hearing some of the discussions from female students about what it feels like to be one of three in a percussion studio at 25 and like all of those things. And I'm now sort of like feeling like I need to message, you know, Lisa and my friends from undergrad and be like, is there anything I owe you beer over? Like me just being a
Yeah.
jerk in studio class, or like, is there anything, you know? Anyway, so I'm just kind of curious from your standpoint, how has the sort of that portfolio of like gender equality, how has that shifted in good ways or bad ways over the sort of your time through school?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. Um, well, first of all, I feel like I can hold like both sides of that at once and like equally. Like I feel the same way in terms of like, yeah, that was my family, you
Mm-hmm.
know, like my percussion studio was they were like my best friends that I was playing music with all of the time. And I'm like really grateful for that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt often like people who were on my side and on my team um, and, you know, friends with me were showing up that way most of the time. And like, yeah, every once in a while, like people have disagreements or arguments or
Mm-hmm.
things that they go through. But then on the other side of that, at every level of schooling I've ever had, there's always been a guy who's been like, uh, you know, like giving me like weirdly competitive vibes, you know, and it's like,
Like what?
or
Give me
or
an example. Like,
oh, I
and you
remember
don't have to name names, but.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Um, like we would start chatting and get to know each other, and I think maybe like um there wasn't I don't think it was my perception that there wasn't a whole lot of like awareness, emotional awareness on their side of
Mm-hmm.
maybe why they were feeling whatever they were feeling towards me. But it was always like, we would make friends and things would be good for a while. And then, like, all of a sudden things would kind of turn and there would be like eye contact avoided, or they'd get like competitive, or they'd get like I like moody, I guess is like a way to
Mm-hmm.
describe it. But and that, that was like one person at
Like an
every
insecurity
club.
thing, or it
I
manifested
think
in some sort of like inappropriate comments, or just like, or was it just like they were like, she's too good, like stuff like that.
I think it was more of like an I don't want to talk to you, like I feel a competition
Mm-hmm.
towards you, and like I'm just going to go do my own thing and like whatever, and just like more of an attitude than like inappropriate comments. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, inappropriate comments weren't that wasn't really a thing for me so much, and I know other people have had different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always just been like to some degree like, oh, why is this why is this person acting that way towards me? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
strange and concerning. Um, but yeah, and it was always it was dealt with, I think, at every level of schooling that I've had, and I think now um, we're having much more honest conversations
Mm-hmm.
about it, like right now.
Well,
And I'm like so appreciative of that, and I think to some extent that they're like that's not just like a male female girls guys dichotomy either. And I think to some extent, like I was watching a bit of this podcast the other day called, I think it's called The Happy Musician.
mm-hmm.
And they were interviewing Rachel Taylor, who's another NIU grad.
Mm.
And she was talking about this moment where she was watching somebody perform, and she was like, and it was like another female student, and she's like, I didn't want them to fail, but I didn't really want them to succeed, and that thought like freaked me out.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, I've had that, where
Oh
it's like
yeah.
you feel this like competition, and it's like, oh my gosh, like what is that in me that's like,
I'm a,
I feel like I have to be the only one in this group, like the only girl who can do it. And I think that like, that internalized misogyny is an issue too, of like, um, women not showing up for other women all the time either. And I don't think
mm.
that this the case, all the time, but I think it's something that crops up, and it's something like to look at in terms of like the stories that we've told ourselves over the years, and like also like what we've seen over the years in terms of like percussion. Like um there wasn't a lot of women, and now there's like more and more that are being given a voice and brought to the forefront
Mm-hmm.
of like, here is a musician and someone I can model my path after. And I think that is like so important, and addressing like that discomfort and that like um that sense of like insecurity, and like why is that there, like what have I told myself about like um this narrative of who I am and how I'm showing up, you know in a group of friends, or musically, or in my career.
Well, as you were talking about the that podcast, Rachel Taylor, is that her name? Excuse me.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you know, her saying that is, I mean, it's very vulnerable of her to be, and it's honest and genuine. But as you're saying, I was just like, listen, Third Coast Percussion played on the Grammys a couple years ago, and if you think for a second that I wasn't at home being like, come on, shit the bed, fellas. Come on, you can do it. Like, like
Yeah,
I want to see
totally.
this plane fly into the mountain on the Gram. And I'm just like, I don't actually believe that.
Right,
But it's the sort
right.
of like crabs in a barrel mentality. I mean, I've heard that term crabs in a barrel. I first heard it from the like Caribbean community that I work with in New York a lot in the steel band world.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of friends of mine will talk about the sort of competitive nature. Like you want the whole community wants to be more present, more seen, but as soon as one person is, there is this natural infighting, and it happens like men against men, women against women. And so like to me, I'm curious how to like you called it misogyny, or that sort of ingrained misogyny when it's a man towards a woman, but those same exact feelings between me and Third Coast, like, is that
Yeah,
misogyny, or is that just me being insecure and being like, why am I not on that stage? You know, like that's
totally. And
just
it's
the
like,
my
it's
lizard brain talking.
complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's complicated too, because I think some of that is like, oh, I'm one of two or three girls in the studio,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanna like really do it and be like the best of the girls, I guess. I don't
Oh, I
know.
see.
You
Yeah.
know, there's like all kinds of complicated like feelings that you have, um or that I have had, I think like revolves around that. And some of that is just like straight up like competition.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it I think can be healthy, and some of it I think is not so healthy. But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's like, important to hold both like the unhealthy stuff and the healthy stuff and the complicated stuff and like the very base instinct stuff, and be like, where is this coming from, and how is this maybe like showing up in the way that I show up for other people in my community,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, let me. I want to ask you a little bit about Cliff, because Cliff is somebody for whom in my life he is. I don't want to assume how he's affected your life, but his sort of presence in my life singularly changed my life's trajectory in many ways. I can't even, like, as soon as you take Cliff out of my life, like almost everything goes away, you know.
Yeah.
And one of the things about Cliff that always struck me was that he was very to a point kind of overprotective of female students that like wanted to go to Trinidad and wanted to be do those things, and it was almost like Yuko sometimes would be like, Cliff, like chill out, she's fine, you know, it's gonna be okay.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like in the steel band world, I have sensed this. Equality isn't the word, but there's definite sort of like gender hierarchies in the pan world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just calling balls and strikes. I'm not saying there's no value judgment here, but like men hold different sway in pan yards than women do.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the best players and most important sections in the band are run by women. The bass sections, for the most part, in my experience, have been dominated by women.
Mm-hmm.
And there's entire panoramas written about women on the bass, and like it's this weird sort of like it's an ecosystem that is sort of functions differently than I think the new music world that I'm in on a daily basis in terms of how that stuff is dealt with. And I'm just kind of curious for you, like what have been your experiences in the pan world? And is anything I'm saying, like, there's a weird acceptance, but also this sort of understood like historical relationships between men and women in this culture, and like how everybody talks and intertwines. And I'm just kind of curious, like, what have you identified, or have you identified anything in that community that speaks to some of the issues we're talking about, or not? I mean, I led with the Cliff being
Yeah.
overprotective because like that is a type of misogyny, but in this weird sort of like he wants to protect, like he cares about you, and he's just like, I know where you want to go, and I'm gonna put you in my pocket and feed you Triscuits and make sure that you come home safe. Like that's you know, but
Yeah.
again, that can be sort of overbearing in another way, and not like let you be a person who has agency in the world. You know, like I'm kind of curious
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
Like, does any of that resonate?
Yeah. I can't speak so much to the pan world necessarily. I played in steel band all 4 years in undergrad,
Mm-hmm.
and then I ran steel band at the University of Minnesota in
Mm-hmm.
grad school for a little while. But beyond like my experiences at NIU, and then I played it with a group here in the Twin Cities, the Panhandlers, a little bit. But I've
Mm-hmm.
never been to Trinidad,
Mm-hmm.
and so I feel like in terms of like that that entire community, I don't have a lot of like good insight on that, but I do
Well,
have insight
the
in
NIU
as far as
the NIU community is very diverse. From what I like, every time I see pictures, I'm like, that's a pretty solid
yeah,
representation across the board. You know.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah. My experiences with Cliff were, uh, yeah, what you're saying definitely resonates with me in terms of like I would come to steel band every day, and whether I was having an absolute uh, shit time
Hmm.
or an amazing time. Can I swear on this
Yeah, yeah,
podcast? Is
sure.
that okay?
I don't care.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't edit these, so it's
Um,
okay.
okay. Whether I was having a shit time or an amazing time,
Hmm.
um, Cliff was there, and I
Mm.
knew that he was looking out for me. Like when
Hmm.
I first started playing tabla, it was like my sophomore year. And I remember, like, throughout my undergraduate experience, I remember being in a million ensembles, never feeling like I had enough time to practice, and then practicing for like a good chunk on like a Saturday. And then by the end of my practice session, I would still feel terrible because that's not a very productive practice session
Hmm.
when you haven't practiced enough all week and then you load it onto your Saturday. And I remember just like showing up to all of my ensembles just tired and not having prepared enough, and like everything I was doing was half-assed because I was doing way too much.
Hmm.
And I remember like Cliff seeing that in me,
Mm.
especially my sophomore year, which was like a really hard year for me. And he I don't even remember exactly what he said, but I remember like I would come in to rehearsal, and he would say like like I see you basically. And I was like, okay, okay. And it was
Hmm.
just like knowing that he saw that, and he was like,
Mm.
I can see that you're suffering. I can see what's going on here. I was like, okay, it's like it's nice to be seen. And I felt that like love from him and like care for all of his students. It's like
Mm.
we were his like clan and his community, and I think like being a part of that and showing up to that however you were, and just like digging in and doing whatever you could, was really that like definitely shaped a lot of my experience in undergrad. And that was like what I took out of that ensemble, was like we were this community, and you showed up every day at, was it at 3 o'clock? I think it was at 3 o'clock, 3 to
Hmm.
4 o'clock, and you did not miss rehearsal for anything, and
Mm.
you showed up and you did your stuff. Um, yeah, yeah,
Well,
and I
it's
think.
no. Sorry. Go
Oh, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Um, yeah, and I think like having that like consistent of a community throughout my undergrad, which was like, yeah, there was definitely like really hard times, and then times where I felt like, okay, I'm getting this, like things are starting to happen and click for me, was really powerful. And it that was because of like the tone that Cliff set and the
Mm.
tone that Liam set too.
Yeah. I mean, when I one of the things that I think I'm struggling with right now in sort of um, our culture, our generation. I mean, how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I am 32.
Okay, so I'm 41. We're not that. We're 9 years different. It's not that crazy of a
Mm-hmm.
difference. Like, one of the things I'm struggling with a little bit in terms of how our culture is dealing with what community means and looks like is the sort of inability or intolerance of any sort of deviation from a belief system or a something counter to the sort of toe the line, right? Like, or you're going to get called out publicly for something you did or didn't do, and then you have to
Yeah.
answer for it publicly. And I think I get it, I understand the desire behind it to try to make things better, to try to, like, there's social commentary and critique that's happening. I don't see a whole lot of communities forming out of that methodology in the way that I was taught by Cliff. I met Cliff when I was like 16. He came
Yeah.
to Dover, Ohio, and the first thing he did was show me two scars on the back of his head and talk to me one on one about what they were. Like, he didn't make a big like show about it, you
Yeah.
know. And like when you were talking about like he sees you, like Cliff is somebody for whom like his suffering radar, because of the experiences he had growing up in Trinidad, is finely tuned. Way more finely tuned than I think most people's are. And Cliff was always somebody who dealt with things privately, at least with me. Like,
Yeah.
he wanted you on the team and he was willing to accept you for, but there were some lines. If you cross the line, you're out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Cliff never made like a public sort of like, I'm gonna go out of my way to like tell everybody about this person. Like, it was more complicated. And I feel like I'm just kind of curious for you, like Cliff was on social media, but he was not the things he said to me privately, he would never say publicly on social media. That
Yeah.
much I can say. And I'm kind of curious for you, like, when Cliff passed, I had this like deep anxiety of like, oh no, like we lost a big community builder, like somebody who, because of the tone he sets, like, and I
Yeah.
think like if I don't know, I'm just kind of curious. Like, I have a little bit of despair about our ability as a social media driven music community to sort of create the same environment that somebody like Cliff creates in person.
Right.
I'm asking, maybe it's not even possible. Like, is it possible to create or allow for complexity in these spaces and create a similar
Well,
environment?
yeah, yeah. I think when I think about community and like Cliff's impact and his radar and like what it was for me at that time,
Mm-hmm.
I think about like the size of the community,
Mm-hmm.
which was like 30 people,
Mm-hmm.
40 people, 50 people,
Yeah.
within the context of the larger school of music. It just wasn't that huge of a group, and so I think like having that contact every day was meaningful, and like having the ritual of like coming together and doing something together and
Mm-hmm.
having a common goal is like those are all things that are just non-existent from the like quote unquote community of social media or musicians in social media, and it's just too big. It's too
Mm-hmm.
big. And so I think okay, well, I should preface this by saying that I am a hopeless optimist. So
Good. That's why I wanted to talk to you,
and
because I'm not.
and
It's fine. Yeah, I'm like
sometimes it gets me into trouble because I'm just like, no, it can happen. We
the
can make it happen. And I like, yeah,
the
I
fav-
get hooked onto things that it's just like, oh, come on.
what I was
Just
talking.
let it go.
The best thing I heard about optimism versus pessimism was like, I'm not a half. I think my favorite. I'm not a half glass is half empty or glass is half full sort of guy. I'm the glass is twice as big as it needs to be sort of guy.
Yeah.
Like, let's just get a smaller glass, then we're good. Like,
Right.
So anyway, continue. Sorry, you're a hopeless
Yeah, yeah.
optimist.
No, I'm definitely a hopeless optimist. And I think I can see the ways in which, we can choose to create our own community, but I
Mm-hmm.
do think it's like a choice for everybody. And I think that um, social media is a useful tool, but I think people have like the issue with it is that people have tried to find community
Mm-hmm.
within social media, like purely through social media. Whereas I think like it helps me to stay in contact with people that I know personally and have met and have like some sort of a connection to. And we can kind of like maintain that connection through social media. But in terms of like, racking up followers and having
Mm-hmm.
thousands and millions of people see your videos, it's just like, this is not sustainable or viable or going to make anybody feel good. This is not a model for community.
Well,
This
especially
is
when
a
the
tool.
one of the things that I feel is different is the call out culture sort of vibe on social media,
Yeah.
where you can sort of do drive by activism and be like, this is terrible, you're a piece of shit, and then you can just go and get your matcha latte and not think twice about what you just did.
Totally.
and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the sort of ecosystem that somebody like Cliff, and I don't mean to like harp on Cliff as like the end all to end all to community building. I mean, there's millions of different versions of healthy communities, but
Right.
the one thing, when Cliff walks in the room and sees you and notices you, there's something that goes unsaid there, where he's like, I see you, so just know that you're being seen. And then you, by default, have to think more about your actions because you know Cliff is watching. And Cliff is
Right.
sort of like a tribal elder. And like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what your feelings are in that moment, he respects them, but your job in that moment is to play your panorama part right. Like,
Right.
there's a little, like, he doesn't say the thing which goes unsaid, which is like, I know you got some shit today,
Mm-hmm.
Krissy. And I know that you want to punch this person in the face and you think this person is an asshole.
Yeah.
I don't care. Take it up with
Mm-hmm.
me later. I got you. But you're playing a C sharp. It should be C natural. Like, that's the thing that, like, I feel you
Yes.
can't do on social media. And so it becomes this space where all of a sudden Krissy is allowed to be like, I'm in a bad mood, therefore you're a bad person. Or I'm seeing this, my feelings about you are this, but they're not. They're based on my own personal trauma that has nothing to do with you. Like,
Yeah.
and there's nobody
Well,
keeping any of that in check. And I feel like that's what Cliff. I'm not saying there needs to be like a social media tribal elder who just says you shut up. Like
yeah,
I don't think
yeah,
that's healthy
totally.
either. But it's just messy.
Well, and when I think about like the way that Cliff did that, um, I think that he's giving you the benefit of the doubt,
Mm.
and like seeing you with like grace and compassion as a complex human, and he's doing all of that just by being like, hey, but I think that we have a choice to do that on social media. I just think it's way, way, way easier to go the opposite
Oh
way.
yeah.
I think it takes more time and more energy and more love for people that you do not know
Mm.
and maybe don't even care to know, really, when it comes down to it. Um, to extend that compassion and say, like, hey, I see that you're, like wrestling with this, or you said this thing. It sounds like that's coming from a place of anger. Like, can you tell me more about that? Because really, everybody just wants to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's way easier to say, like, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. And because we're all hiding behind the screen and there's no like face to face consequences.
Yeah.
So I think it's possible. Again, hopeless optimist. But yeah, but it's just easier to do the other thing.
Well, it's why I put out the note initially that connected us here. It was because it's shocking to me, and again, like my anxiety about getting called out because of where I am in the community and what I do or don't do well. Like, I have it. It's not. I shouldn't dwell on it, but I do. I I just wish. Like, I wish there was a sound like what's the Trinity, they call it stupping, like the sucking air through your teeth
Oh yeah.
is like a sign of like if you said something to Cliff and he didn't agree with you, but he wasn't gonna like, it just wasn't worth his time to crawl up your ass about it. He'd be just like, and he'd walk away. It's like, I wish there was
Yeah.
that button on Facebook where we could just click the Stoops button or whatever, and like it would make that sound when you opened up your feed. Like, it's not a
Yes.
call
Oh my
out,
gosh,
but
that'd be amazing.
it's just the sort of like, yeah, whatever sound.
Yeah, like I don't know about that.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, since I appreciate you talking about Cliff. It always just, I could talk about Cliff every podcast, and I feel like I'd never get to the bottom of him. But um, tabla is another sort of sliver. If the loaf of percussion music was all these different or music was all these different slices, tabla is a slice that is kind of like the third rail of percussion music, where one of the third rails, not in any sort of bad way, but just sort of like, you touch that one, you realize how much fucking work you have to do. Like, there are people, it's
Yeah.
like, and the güiro is the same way. As soon as you see somebody in Venezuela playing the güiro, you're like, oh, what am I
Yeah.
doing with my life? But tabla is something you can't really, like güiro. I can learn a couple patterns and be somebody, I think he knows what a 3/2 clave is or whatever.
Right.
Tabla, you can't really fake it. It's such a
Yeah.
specific and culturally based, like, there are people who spend years just with the syllables before they even touch a drum. And I'm
Right.
I'm kind of curious for you, how has that sort of cultural, dipping your toe in that cultural pool, how has that sort of what has been similar to the pan world that you've had with Cliff and Liam, and what has been
Hmm.
different for you? And if you want to talk about the differences in gender too, I'm just curious if that culture, how they see these sort of relationships as well.
Sure. Yeah. Um, I think when I first started playing tabla my sophomore year, I started out in Robert Chappell's
Mm-hmm.
tabla class, just
Mm-hmm.
like doing it. And like I was saying, like my that second year of undergrad was like really tough. And that whole next summer, all I did was practice tabla and watch videos of Zakir Hussein and nap. I didn't see any of my friends. I didn't go out. I was just like, I am healing. This is my cocoon.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I exist now. And then I got a lot better at it. And I think maybe part of the reason that that instrument like resonated with me so much at that time was because I had put so much expectation on what I was supposed to know as a
Mm.
percussionist. And, like we're constantly trying to like like juggle all of the skills that we need to know, like your four mallet marimba, your snare drum rolls, your excerpts, your timpani, like everything. And I think I felt just, I like took that pressure on, and I took it so hard when I
Mm.
couldn't handle all of it and juggle all of it the ways I wanted to. And so I think when I sat down to play tabla, I was like, no one expects anything from me on this instrument. Like, this is, I'm a beginner. I'm like truly a
Mm.
beginner.
Mm.
It's so deep. I feel like I'm just like, I just, yeah, literally putting my toe in the ocean and then realizing like how massive the ocean was. And so I think like there was a certain amount of freedom in that for me. And
Mm.
so I kept playing, and I also like really, we're playing with like implements all the time. I really loved being able to touch my instrument, like
Mm.
that
Mm-hmm.
physical contact. I was like, oh, like I'm making this connection. I see what's happening, and I can like feel the resonance of my instrument kind of in a different way. And so, yeah, I kind of dove into that. And then, like, I wrote an undergraduate grant to go to Mumbai the next summer.
Mm.
And I got that. And I went to go study with Pandit Yogesh Samsi, who's like still my teacher that I study with.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, absolutely incredible player. Like,
Mm.
and someone who is just like, has dug so deep not only into like the tradition as it like currently exists today, but like kind of um his like calling card is taking these like old like Punjab Gharana, which is like the style of playing compositions, and like bringing them back to life.
Mm.
And his playing is just like so like buttery and expressive and brilliant that it's just like your face is immediately melted, like
It's, I mean,
upon seeing.
tabla playing. I mean, it's one of the. I've seen Zakir Hussain. So did a thing with Zakir Hussain years ago before I joined the group, and then I went to see Silk Road Ensemble at Zenkel Hall in New York with Sandeep Das, I believe, was the guest artist,
Yeah.
and then growing up listening to Ravi Shankar and Ala Raka, like there's something
Yeah.
I look at, tabla playing, like good tabla players, it sort of is like looking at like manga cartoons or something. Like you're like you all are, or like an octopus or something. You're like, you are not like any other species of animal on this planet. Like there's something about the tabla that feels like it like fell off a meteor or something, like 2,000 years ago and landed in
Yeah.
India, and it was like that. They're just like, well, this is what we're doing. I know that's
Totally.
not all the case, but it's such a specific skill set where like most other drummers drumming practices are visceral. Like you have a like there's a full body thing, and I look at tabla players and I think like you don't even need your body. You just need these things right here, and you can do like
It's this.
yeah, it's kind of nuts. Like what in terms of the
Yeah.
the teaching, like is the rote teaching, or I don't want to assume it's rote, is the style of teaching with your teacher in India and Mumbai, how is stuff sort of disseminated back and forth between the two of you? Does he just play for you and then you replicate it, or
Well, he will usually what happens in a lesson is first of all I have to record the whole lesson
Mhm.
because I just don't have that like auditory retention. I'm
Mhm.
like definitely a visual learner, and like I didn't grow up learning like that, like you would in that culture. And so I record my lesson, and he'll speak the syllables to me.
Mhm.
So he'll say like da terikita dagena dage dena. And then he'll say, okay, now you. And then I go da terikita dagena dage dena. And then once I can recite, like there's a lot of theme and variation, especially in like the early compositions that you learn.
Mhm.
And so we'll do that with the theme, and then we'll do that with each one of the variations. And then once I recite it, then I play it. He doesn't even have drums in some of our lessons. He's just reciting and just telling me
Mm.
through the bowls, which is the tabla language, like what to play.
Mhm.
And so, yeah. And then I would take it back with me, listen to the recording, write it all down so that I could see it. And then like highlight where some of like the downbeats are to
Mm.
understand like how it would fit. And then I would just rep it over and over again until it felt comfortable.
And is there
But
any are there any sort of like in Trinidad, I always feel bad because I keep bringing it back to Trinidad, but like in Trinidad, when I go down there, like I've built up enough trust with people that I know there, people I've worked with and played with or studied with, like, but I'm still a foreigner. I mean, for the obvious reasons,
Yeah.
like I stick out like a sore thumb down there
Yeah.
anyway. But like even Kendall Williams, who is of Trinidadian descent, when he goes there, he's a foreigner, and he's arranged for
Yeah.
big bands and all that stuff down there.
Right.
But for you, like, what are the cultural? Are there any sort of like things that are very clear in terms of the boundaries of like what a foreigner does or doesn't do within this music? Like, how is that stuff talked about at all, or is it just sort of generously sort of disseminated?
Um, yeah, I think there is well, and okay, I guess something that I struggle with too, and this is like an interesting um conversation to have with you because I think you can probably relate in playing pan is that like um you can like I guess I sit as a player in this space between like okay, I'm like digging in what I practice, like 80 to 90% of my practice is like working on my traditional rep
Mm-hmm.
and just like digging into that, digging into the culture, digging into my sounds. And then but then I also like have this uh other set of skills, which is that of like, not such a beginner as a musician,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
having like, gone to school for it. And so I think like that's really where I've kind of like found myself in terms of like being a player is like I'm a professional musician, but I don't at all feel like a professional tabla player
Mm-hmm.
because I'm still just
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, I've got maybe a foot in now into the ocean
Yeah.
instead of just a toe. And so it's really interesting because I think there is, like when you look at the Guaranas historically, there's like all these different styles of tabla playing. There's like a handful of styles of tabla playing that are specific to each region. And historically, those were like heavily guarded secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, your if you were a guru, your disciples were like either your, like direct, like your son, or it was like somebody in your family,
Mm-hmm.
And so then, like, I think, with the internet and globalization and like information moving around so much these days, that has like absolutely like loosened and opened up, and now there's just like more people playing tabla, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's something that I struggle with too because I feel like I show up and so like after I started playing tabla, I went to grad school for percussion. When I got out of grad school, I was like, this is my instrument. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
really what I want to do. And I started digging in. And then I started kind of like building, um, like trying to figure out how to build a life basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I like started a percussion group called Matra. And it was like marimba and vibraphone and tabla and drum set. And we added a bass player later. And I was still just like, a beginner and trying to kind of like learn how to take this instrument that doesn't have so much a place in like the music that I knew and that I felt like was home to me, which was percussion music, and trying to figure out how to apply that. And so I did like a lot of growing up, I think, as a musician and as a tabla player, like through that group. And then now I'm kind of at a spot where it's like sometimes I think about like what other tabla players think about my playing. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I have no idea. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I think there's like a pretty big difference in like I think they would think I play slower because I absolutely do. I've always wished I had faster hands.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I'm always working on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they would think that like, my low drum, like I let resonate for too long, but that's also like part of what I feel like fits into the music that I end up playing on that instrument. So and then sometimes it like swings back to the more like traditional rap, but in terms of like that scene and culturally, it's hard for me to tell sometimes
Well,
like
have you
where
talked
I
to
exist in that.
have you talked to your teacher about, like, have you showed your teacher any of the stuff that you're working on that's not directly tied to the traditional stuff that he's doing?
A little bit. I know that he's seen some of my things online, and he hasn't said like too much about it. We've mostly just, like work on the things that we work on. But I mean, that's a good idea. Maybe that would be a good idea
Well,
to have that conversation.
it's one of the things I wish I would have asked Cliff more about is Cliff,
Yeah.
what should I be doing? What could I be doing better about my approach to pan playing? Like
Right.
you mentioned up front about like, oh, don't tell Cliff about the microtonal pan, like
Yeah.
it's only just out of, well, the reason I might have joked about that was just out of a reverence and awe for what, I mean, Cliff was one of the, I mean, it's like him and Ellie Manette, and there's like three other people who invented the instrument, for God's sakes, like, and Cliff
Right.
and Ellie were sort of responsible for disseminating it in the United States. Like, there's a lot of like, like reverence I have to give, and the
Yeah.
idea that he might have not liked something I did was important to me. But
Yeah.
Cliff was always one who, that's why I asked. Like, I'm curious what your teacher thinks, because Cliff, even if Cliff didn't like it, I remember him coming to a so percussion master class, and we played some pan, and I was like, and I was like, and one of my biggest mentors, Cliff Alexis, and I pointed to him. We were in a big gymnasium. It was like a symposium thing that everybody in the school had to come to. I was like, Cliff, I just cannot thank you enough for everything. I motioned over to him, and he was out like a light, just sleeping, snoring in the front row. And I just was like, moving on, like, and
Yeah.
but
That's
to
awesome.
me, I feel like Cliff was like, all right, he's supporting pan.
Hmm.
I don't like microtonal pan, but okay. Like, I think that's what Cliff would have said.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
like, I'm curious. I don't know. There was a little bit of generosity with and I think Trinidadians too are very experimental with a lot of different sort of types. It's a big mishmash of many different diasporas of music, that like experimentation in Trinidad has been a big thing. But in the tabla world, I don't know if that's a similar thing. I'm curious what the like does your teacher do like weird experimental tabla? Do people put contact mics on tabla and run them through pitch shifters and like stuff like that? Is that type of practice common in India, or is it like straight down the pike? You got to learn the regular stuff.
I mean, in my experience, is pretty straight down the pike.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like, I guess I would say that there's like a couple different kinds in terms of like, you're either learning traditional stuff or you're learning like filmy music, like Bollywood music, and
Mm-hmm.
like working on your grooves. But yeah, in terms of like experimental stuff, like Zakir is the guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's who does that kind of stuff. And I think like there's and like his student Sufala, she does, I would say, like more experimental stuff with tabla in terms of like miking and playing along to like some electronic music,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not a lot of it at all. Like I
Mm-hmm.
think culturally, it's pretty like, yeah, straight down the pike. And so yeah, I think my feelings towards that have just been like, okay, like I'm gonna go to my lesson and like learn what I can, and then like I'm kind of trying to do this thing over here, but just like, yeah, it's that same kind of like, okay, I'm just like, I'm gonna do my best and trying to understand like this tradition and really like sink in as much as I can. But yeah, I guess I haven't ever really thought to like bring that to my teacher so much, because I'm kind of just like, well, you probably won't think like much of this, and it's like, just what I'm trying to do, but
Sometimes,
maybe that's
I mean, sometimes I've seen it go both ways. I sometimes, if you have a good relationship with your teacher, I think it's going to go the good way,
yeah,
which is he may say like, "Oh, I don't have no idea what you're doing here, but seems great," or he could
yeah,
say, "I notice you're letting your low drum ring a lot. Why?" And you'll say, "Oh, well, it's because of this," and he'll say, "Oh, well, what if you let your high drum ring a lot on this thing, or whatever?" Like,
sure,
he may just be like, "Yeah, let's get in and till the soil a bit and see what comes of it."
yeah,
Just in terms of like, I think it's important for me that it doesn't mean that you should stop experimenting. But if he's like, I'd be curious, because if he does all of a sudden is like, wait a minute, I noticed you used this one particular part of a tala or whatever, or a raga, and you clipped off this chunk.
hmm,
And I think maybe, I mean, maybe you're not at the point in your studies with him where he's like, you do understand the part you clipped out, right? And you're going to be like, no, what? And you're like, well, that's the reference to all of these gods or whatever. Like, and like something
yeah,
super important that you may not
right,
know. And then you'd be like, oh, okay. maybe I'll put that back in and cut out the chunk that wasn't so important, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Who knows? But
Totally.
I think it's for me as a white person playing pan right now, like I'm very curious about like what's the patient zero? Like where did this start? What are the initial intentions of this art form, and what were they doing? So I know at least what platform I'm sort of jumping off of and going in a different direction.
Yeah, totally.
But anyway, Krissy, this has been really fun. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And my policy on the podcast is that the door is always open. So if there's something else comes up, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to have you back on and, go from there. And I'm curious, is there anything for like if folks want to check out your work and see what you're doing, like where can they find you? Where can they find you?
Yeah. I have a website. It's KrissyBergmark.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, mostly those two. And then my trio is Sprig of That.
Sprig of That?
Sprig of That,
okay.
Yep. And we're at sprigofThat.com, also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And we're actually releasing an album April 2nd, and we're doing like one tune every single Friday.
Whoa.
And we're doing actually podcast episodes with those tunes.
Nice.
Yeah, we commissioned 8 different composers around like the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And then we're performing all their pieces and releasing that April 2nd. So
where are you performing them? Are you doing them like remotely and streaming them?
Well, sorry, I shouldn't say we're performing them. We were going to perform them, and then, when everything shut down, we turned it into a recording project. And so that's the album that's being released.
Who are the 7 composers?
There are 8 composers, and they're
sorry.
Kashimana Ahua, Adam Conrad Ferguson, Zach Baltich, Yijan Eryaman. I should pull up the list. Let me pull up the list.
Sorry, I hate when people do this to me too, because I always forget like 4 people and then.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
It's okay. Sorry about
pull
that.
It up. No, I can pull it up. It's good to list them.
Well, be sure to send me the link to that because I'd love to check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Asuka Kakatani. Let's see, Michelle Kinney, and Erica Malpass, and Tarek Abdelkader. I think that's everybody.
Awesome.
That's everybody.
That sounds like 8 completely different pieces to me, and that's awesome. That's the point.
Yeah. It's definitely been a blast to like put all of that into the voice of the trio. It's been really fun.
Well, so. I have one final question about Minnesota.
Yeah.
That's where you're at, right?
Yes.
Is the Bachelor Farmer still open?
Oh my gosh. I don't know. Honestly, it's been so long since I've like thought about a restaurant besides like my go-to takeout.
Yeah.
Which I'm like literally 3 doors down from like one of my favorite pizza places and one of the best places in the Twin Cities, Pizza Luce. But yeah, I don't know if it's still open.
My wife and I, that's our favorite restaurant in the world.
Oh my gosh, really?
I had one of.
Embarrassingly, I haven't even been yet, and I've heard so much about it.
It's not cheap. It's not like we go there. I mean, I live in Connecticut. I don't go there on the regular, but it's like if we go to Minnesota, I put aside like, this is going to cost $700, but we're going to do a tasting menu, like where the chef just brings you out a sampling of everything they make, and I'm going to sit there for 4 hours. And there's going to be this woman was a sommelier, but she was like a tobacco sommelier. She was a whiskey sommelier, a wine. And so she was just like, oh, with this, you might want to try this particular smoky whiskey. And then and it was just like 4 hours later, I just walked out of that place being like, I don't care how much it costs. Like, I don't regret this. It was anyway.
That sounds like a beautiful experience.
If you get a chance to go there, absolutely, do it. You won't regret it. So, hey, Krissy, sorry to end on that weird sort of inside baseball talk about Minnesota, but it's important to me. Food is important to me. Stay safe and healthy, and it was lovely chatting with you, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Yeah, it was wonderful chatting with you too. It's such an honor to be on your podcast.
Well, the feeling's mutual.
Thank you so much for having me.
Stay healthy, and we'll talk soon.
All right, thanks. You too. Bye.
Bye. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. This podcast is brought to you by Liquid Drum, liquiddrum.com down in Waco, Texas. My good friend Todd Meehan runs an amazing percussion company down there. Great merch, great content. Check him out, liquiddrum.com. Also, Kyle Dunleavy, DunleavyPans.com, DUNLEAVY pans.com. Kyle Dunleavy makes and builds all the steel drums that I perform and teach on in So Percussion, as well as at NYU and Princeton. He's an amazing tuner builder, just a really nice guy, very dependable. Check him out. If you are interested at all in steel pan advocacy, want to learn more about the goings-on in pan in Brooklyn, check out paninmotion.com. My good friend Kendall Williams, Jerry Guy, Trisha Guy, and Arisha John run an amazing organization called paninmotion.com. Check them out. And finally, Alejandro Mirage runs an amazing clothing apparel company in Brooklyn that is steel pan centric. You can check him out at mangochow, CHOW, clothing.com. I own a bunch of his shirts. They're amazing, very stylish, beautifully made. Check them out. mangochowclothing.com. Okay, hope you're well. Talk to you soon. Bye.